From CGTN headquarters in Beijing, this is The Hub with Wang Guan.
Hello and welcome to The Hub on CGTN. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. Chinese Foreign Minister and State Councilor Wang Yi meets U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken on the sidelines of the G20 Foreign Ministers meeting in Bali, Indonesia. Diplomatic engagement between China and the United States has been at their most frequent in recent months. First, it was a face-to-face meeting between the two countries' defense ministers in Singapore. Then Vice Premier of China Liu He and U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen met virtually to discuss tariffs, among other things. Now, the meeting of the two countries' senior foreign policy officials. Now, to what extent will these meetings ease long-simmering tensions between Beijing and Washington? Now, Thornton is Senior Fellow and Visiting Lecturer at the Paul Tsai China Center at Yale Law School. She's a retired diplomat for over 30 years. Thornton was the Acting Assistant Secretary of State on East Asian and Pacific Affairs at the U.S. State Department. She's now joining us from Lisbon, Maine. And in Beijing, I'm joined by Da Wei, Director of the Center for International Security and Strategy and Professor at the School of Social Sciences at Tsinghua University. Welcome to both of you. Apitas Thornton, or Madam Thornton, great to have you with us. Last time we met, it was in New York City. We talked about the fact that we much welcome you to come to our show, and finally and thankfully there you are. A lot can happen in 4 years' time, obviously. First of all, your reading on the meeting between Wang Yi and Antony Blinken. What do you think has come out of this meeting?
Well, I'm very encouraged. Thank you so much for having me on the show. And I'm very encouraged that both sides pronounced that the talks were constructive and candid. I think that at this point in U.S.-China relations, we see a sort of uptick in meetings and discussions between our top-level leaders. We had recently, in the last couple of days, a discussion between our top two military commanders. And so I think this meeting is another step toward maybe setting up a more constructive agenda. I don't think we shouldn't overstate the fact, that of the constructive cooperation that they announced, but I think it is a good sign that they are able to meet and communicate. And I think also it's important that obviously part of the reason for this meeting is to try to set up some high-level communication between our two presidents, and I think that's also extremely important at this stage in U.S.-China relations. Right.
Director Da Wei, let me turn to you. We've heard from the Chinese side. The Chinese side released a statement soon after the meeting. What is the most important consensus reached, in your opinion?
I think, first of all, thank you, Wang Guan, for having me and with Susan on this program. On this meeting, I agree with Susan's assessment. I think for me, it's quite encouraging. I would like to say this is probably the most encouraging meeting so far we have seen since last January when Biden came into power. From Chinese side's readout, I think two things are very important. First is probably the two leaders will have some kind of dialogue in near future. This is critical, important. The other thing is, I think they laid out some specific, concrete consensus or agreement between the two sides, including the so-called U.S.-China Joint Task Force, and also facilitating the job of the diplomatic service in two capitals, and also resumption of the people-to-people exchanges. I think these concrete outcomes are very encouraging and badly needed by the two sides.
Yeah, Director Da Wei, let me stay with you because we've seen the statement where Wang Yi proposed 4 lists of requests on managing this relationship. What's new in Beijing's lists of requests?
I think Beijing, this is probably from the list you mentioned, I think this is the first time that China elaborates its concerns and its dissatisfaction with those, so-called 4 no's and 5 no's from the American side, because the Biden administration already say that the U.S. Has no intention, like having the new Cold War, and they have 4 no's and 1 no intention. And these are, of course, very good signals from both sides. But the problem is, if the U.S. side signals are so positive, why China still feel dissatisfied? I think this time, State Councilor Wang Yi gave a quite detailed elaboration about China's response to that. Though it's concerns, it's criticism, but I think it will be helpful because China side tell them why we are what we are angry at, what we are unhappy about. I think this is an important step towards solving or easing the tension of the two sides.
Susan, what messages did you pick up from Antony Blinken's press conference? I mean, he did give a press conference soon after his meeting with Wang Yi.
Yeah, I thought that Secretary Blinken's remarks were definitely more constructive than the kinds of things that we've heard previously, and I think that is an indicator of the desire to sort of set up a good atmosphere for higher level communication between the two presidents. I mean, certainly his press conference remarks focused, at least for the American side, on the discussions around some of the top issues that were of concern in the G20 foreign ministers meeting, and particularly, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the kind of turmoil that is creating throughout the globe in terms of food security and in terms of energy prices, et cetera. But I think that Blinken's focus on other issues and on trying to sort of set up a more constructive frame for the relationship was important, and we didn't see any kind of negative really comments or things that would create a really objectionable atmosphere for the two presidents upcoming, as we've seen sometimes in the past after these meetings. So I think that's fairly important that the readout from Secretary Blinken was quite factual and sort of straight and positive, I would say.
Yeah, Susan, you worked in the State Department for decades. In the statement offered by the Chinese side, Beijing said the two sides said consensus was reached on the resumption of working groups, including protection and taking better care of consular staff and diplomats from both countries. Also, they agreed to increase people-to-people and cultural exchanges. How do you feel about all these progress?
Yeah, well, I think these things are important, and frankly, we should not underestimate the dramatically negative impact of the pandemic on U.S.-China relations. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has done devastating damage to our relationship, in part because of the way that it has inhibited kind of people-to-people communication between the U.S. and China, which has always been so important for trying to undergird the relationship and improving mutual understanding. And so I think this is very important. Of course, diplomats should not face arbitrary and kind of, petty resistant blocks to doing their job in capitals. I mean, this is not the way to prosecute a relationship between the world's, two largest economies and major powers. And so letting diplomats do their job is very important, and I think we should not follow the path of kind of tit-for-tat reciprocity in this area. And people-to-people exchange, reestablishing travel and connections is crucially important as well.
Yeah, many would argue that a better treatment of journalists from both sides are also badly needed at this point. I want to talk about tariffs. I want to ask both of you this question about tariffs. The Biden administration said that they're looking to reconfigure some of the Trump-era tariffs on China, but on Friday, Biden said he has not made any decision whatsoever on the tariffs. Of course, there's a difference between the politically expedient thing to do versus the economically sound thing to do. So first of all, Susan, let me ask you, on China tariffs, what do you think is the economically sound thing to do? Not just for the American consumers and companies, but for China-U.S. economic relations at large?
Well, I mean, I am in the camp who definitely thinks that the tariffs should be rolled back. I mean, there may be a step, kind of series of steps in doing so, But up to now, we've seen this extremely cumbersome process of tariff exemptions, which I think is the wrong direction to head in. It just empowers kind of bureaucratic licensing authorities and is really inefficient. I think the part of the political impetus is, of course, to try to reduce prices in the U.S. because we're facing very high inflation. But there's political pressures on the other side, too, of course, from industries and unions and people like that who are major constituencies for President Biden. So he's having to consider, very, very carefully all of the various trade-offs. But I think taking the tariffs and rolling them back in some fashion is certainly overdue.
Yeah, well, we've seen the AFL-CIO, the largest labor union in the United States, is holding very different opinions versus, let's say, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, for example, who is arguing for a resumption of those tariffs. Director Dawei, what do you think?
Yeah, I think, of course, tariff is something that if the U.S. side can roll back and then China side can do something reciprocal, of course, that's a good thing. But to be frank, my expectation is not very high. I think obviously the Biden administration have some differences among their senior officials, and also there are some rumors about a very limited amount of goods the tariff be cut, maybe about 10 billion Chinese exportation to the U.S. I think that's comparing with the overall amount of the trade, it's very, very limited. So I think we need to, of course, I welcome this kind of rollback, but I think we need to keep our expectation not too high. I think the Biden administration, as Susan pointed out, has its difficulty domestically, and also probably the companies, the business community, both in China and the U.S., has already digested the cost of the tariff in past 4 years. So that will not, even if it happened, the rollback of the tariff, that will not change the economic relations too much. And also it will only have a limited compact on the U.S. inflation situation domestically. So again, I welcome any this effort, but I keep my expectation not too high.
Yeah, most reports indicate that the Biden administration is merely considering exempting $10 billion worth of tariffs out of the $370 billion worth of tariffs, goods on which Trump imposed tariffs on. That is the goods that China sent to the United States every year. On the security side of the relations, let's talk about Taiwan. Director Dawei, let me start with you. Do you think there's enough guardrail, or there are enough guardrails when it comes to containing and managing the risk factor of Taiwan in China-U.S. relations?
Of course, we don't have enough guardrail regarding Taiwan issue. I think this is the most dangerous flashing point that the two biggest economy may have a military conflict or even a war. I think in this dialogue between State Councilor Wang Yi and Secretary Blinken, China side emphasized a lot about Taiwan issue, importance of the three joint communique, and also One China principle. I think this is, of course, the Taiwan issue is the most sensitive and the old issue from the very beginning of the normalization. I don't think it will be solved easily. And also, remember, Taiwan is part of China. So it's not a potential conflict over Taiwan Strait. It's not international. Of course, if China and the U.S. have conflict, this is an international conflict. But it's more complicated than that because the two sides across strait are part of China. So how to build a guardrail over an issue that China view as domestic affairs? I think that's quite challenging for the two sides. And the most important thing is to rebuild the trust of the two sides. China build the trust on China side that the U.S. still stick to the One China policy, and the trust in the U.S. side, the confidence in the U.S. side about China won't use military means in the near future.
Susan, how do you look at the accusation from Beijing that the Biden administration is merely paying lip service to its one China policy? How do you think the two sides can really effectively manage Taiwan as one of the biggest risk factors facing China-U.S. relations?
Yeah, I do agree with Dao Wei that the Taiwan issue is a most concerning flashpoint in our relationship. And it's telling that both in this conversation between State Councilor Wang Yi and Secretary Blinken and in the earlier conversation in Luxembourg between National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and Director Yang Jiechi, that this issue was the one that took up, most of the Chinese readout, frankly, in both of those conversations. And I think it's going to be very difficult, as Dao Wei said, to build a guardrail over this issue. There's a pretty big disconnect, I think, between the U.S. and China on the trust issue. I mean, the U.S. keeps repeating its one China policy formulation, and the Chinese side doesn't believe anymore that it is actually abiding by the one China policy. And I think that the reason for that has a lot to do with the difference in our systems. I mean, the administration, the Biden administration, I think, can try to discipline its own officials, but it's very hard for it to discipline other officials in other quarters in the U.S. government, like Congress, and also, of course, can't discipline sort of the raucous and very loud kind of voices that come from within democratic U.S. society on this issue. So, I think China believes that the Biden administration should be controlling more things that happen with respect to Taiwan in the U.S., and the Biden administration kind of thinks it's doing its part within its own policy lane. And I think that has always been a problem on Taiwan, but it's definitely been exacerbated of late. And I think we do have to rebuild trust, as Dao Wei said, on this issue. I think we can do it, but it is not that easy in the current environment.
Yeah, we'll see what happens to China-U.S. relations and whether or not there will be a summit happening soon. Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Director Dao Wei. Come back again soon. We'll take a short break. You're watching The Hub on CGTN. Welcome back. Japan's former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's tragic assassination shocked the world in a stunning tragedy. He was murdered by a lone gunman on Friday during an election campaign. As world leaders, including Chinese President Xi Jinping, expressed sorrow and condolences, Japan is bracing for potential aftershocks. What is the legacy of Shinzo Abe, who was Japan's longest-serving prime minister? And what are the aftershocks for Japanese politics? Joining me now is Professor Jia Daojun from the School of International Studies at Peking University in Beijing. Professor Jia, always good to see you there. First of all, your thoughts and emotions when you saw the news and the images of the assassination of the former Japanese prime minister. What went through your mind?
Well, certainly this is a needless and a tragic loss of a human being and of a statesman for not just for Japan, and Japan being an important country of the global community. Mr. Abe served for his government, and he was also a very active participant in global governance. So a lot more can be said at these sort of situations, but then what we can do is to offer condolences to the family and to the Japanese society. Then we move on.
I mean, there are so many puzzling pieces to this assassination. I mean, there were 22 security personnel at Shinzo Abe's rally, yet they couldn't, number one, clear the site before this incident happened. And number two, they couldn't spot the gunman whatsoever. And number three, they couldn't stop him. Was there a dereliction of duty on the part of Abe's security team? What kind of security was offered to a former Japanese head of government?
This is I thought this is a strange topic to ask a professor of international studies to comment on. But what we can say is that...
But it is a question on the mind of many. I mean, how could this happen, considering there are only 8-9 gun violence happening in Japan, and this happened to a Japanese prime minister?
You have to remember that, number one, Japan is an extremely peaceful society. By law, private gun ownership is not permitted. And then the use of guns as a means of settling disputes even among individuals is rather limited and very, very sporadic. And I do believe you're questioning about the security guards. They train themselves according to the social economic environment they are in. Well, it's tragic the way it ended. I'm sure the security guards system of Japan will learn from this, but I wouldn't think it would be very fair to sort of take issue with how they performed.
No, I'm not pointing fingers, but fair enough. What you said is fair enough. Professor Jia, as Japan's longest-serving prime minister, that is Shinzo Abe, he made broad economic reforms known as Abenomics. Japan also became a stronger ally of the United States. How would you assess his legacy, both domestically and in terms of foreign policy?
Well, several books can be written about his legacy. And of course, you know, him being the prominent politician, a lot of policies identified with him as the person. But in terms of Abe economics, mainly inflation and monetary easing, this is not unique to Japan. It's been practiced, especially against the background of pandemic, in major economies. And then there are challenges in that policy as well. But as for alliance with the United States, it takes two to dance. It's not just Japan, it's also the United States. But then Abe's main contribution is to instill in the minds of American security elites this idea of an Indo-Pacific. It used to be called the Arc of Democracy and Freedom. Now, with Quad, actually is a direct brainchild of Abe's articulations, and some would say his efforts in convincing what used to be a skeptical President Trump to sign up onto this. So we'll wait and see how all these things play out.
Right. We know that Abe had considerable influence on the current Fumio Kishida administration of Japan. How do you think his absence will impact the current administration and the ruling party? Especially, what do you think will be the impact on the upper house elections coming up this Sunday?
Again, this is almost a book-length subject. But yes, the serving Prime Minister Kishida and his immediate predecessor Suga understood to be from the same group, political faction of Mr. Abe. In other words, you have had a long continuation of Mr. Abe's fingerprints on policies. Point one. Point two is that the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan, has evolved to be the dominant party. There is no serious opposition whatsoever in the Japanese political system anymore. And then that does mean the election on Sunday is not going to be too much affected with or without this tragic development involving Mr. Abe himself, I would think. And then the Japanese society and politics at large functions pretty much by consensus, and that consensus is very strong. And does not really have a lot to do with the coming and leaving of one particular individual. There is that general understanding of between the elites and the operating senior officials, and then most of the business leaders of a general direction society is going. So, in other words, it can seem to be a little chaotic given this very tragic and an unusual assassination, but we need to bear in mind the mainstay of Japanese politics and society is stability, its predictability.
Yeah, many of the institutions in Japan are long-established fair to say. Finally, Professor Zhang, I want to ask you about Japan's, Shinzo Abe's one other legacy. He has been one of more local politicians advocating for a revised constitution to remilitarize Japan, if you will. How do you see this debate going, that is remilitarization versus the status quo?
Well, this is a very touchy issue for the Japanese society. A debate about a formal revision of the Constitution has been going on for some 20 or plus years. And there are advocates from beyond Japan that want to make it formal. But we need to bear in mind at least 3 points. One is that Japanese security policy has changed with or without the change of wording. And secondly, the Japanese society remains pacifist. In other words, to the extent politicians may want to, if you think about the so-called Indo-Pacific or even with the Ukraine situation, you may have dynamics in the political circles that want to make Japan militarily, show the flag around the world, but the Japanese society remains deeply pacifist. So that's a second point. A third point is that Japan is probably one of those societies that has that potential of militarizing very fast, given its own past of a military-industrial complex and the capacity to manufacture weapons. So we will need to be very careful with this. Rather than just looking whether or not the Constitution is revised, we'll have to see the actual actions.
Professor Zhao Daojing from Peking University, thanks so much for these perspectives.
You're welcome.
That will do it for this edition of The Hub on CGTN. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing.